Hey, what's up guys? Today I want to talk about safety rules, specifically safety rules as it relates to handling firearms. Without a doubt, gun safety is the most crucial aspect of gun ownership. If you cannot handle, store, and use a gun safely, then you have no business using a gun. You're actually more of a liability than an asset, and probably more of a danger to yourself and others than that possible threat you're intending on protecting yourself or others from. Before we talk about specific safety rules, let's go ahead and define some terms. Safety is defined as the condition of being protected from or unlikely to cause danger, risk, or injury. Rules are a set of explicitly or understood regulations or principles governing conduct within a particular activity or sphere. The next term I want to define is systems, because not only do I want to cover safety rules, I also want to discuss safety systems that you can apply those rules to, because a rule is only as good as the person who hears it and the system it's applied under. A system is a set of principles or procedures according to which something is done, an organized framework or method. We're going to use those definitions in determining what are good safety rules, because obviously we're determining rules or looking for rules that keep us safe within the realm of handling guns and firearms related activities. So when we're discussing what causes an unintentional discharge, we have three things that occur. One is you need a gun that's loaded, where there's a round in the chamber and the gun is cocked. Then you need someone or something to touch and pull the trigger such that it actually releases the sear and engages the firing process. An additional thing I'd say is where the gun is oriented. So if the gun is oriented at a person and you have an unintentional shooting, well, then someone's going to get injured. If it's not oriented at a person, then you'll probably just have property damage. Now that we know the modes that can cause an unintentional discharge and then the effects of an unintentional discharge, let's discuss some safety measures that can be applied to mitigating that. Bear in mind that whatever safety system we develop, it needs to be robust enough so that it applies in multiple contexts where you may be handling a gun. Rather than reinventing the wheel, let's go ahead and talk about some safety rules that have been out there for a long time. The first set we'll talk about are probably the most popular ones out there, and they were developed by Lieutenant Colonel Jeff Cooper. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the name Jeff Cooper, just understand that he was and still remains the most influential figure in the firearms community. And to my knowledge, Cooper was actually one of the first to develop a set of safety rules for how to handle guns and mitigate or prevent accidental, negligent, or unintentional discharges. And those rules are: rule number 1, all guns are always loaded. Rule number 2, never let the muzzle cover anything you are not willing to destroy. Rule number 3, keep your finger off the trigger till your sights are on target. And rule number 4, identify your target and what is beyond it. Now, before I critique these rules and subsequently enrage some of you or most of you, just understand that Einstein, who is considered the father of modern physics, got it wrong sometimes. He got it wrong with his cosmological constant. He also got it wrong with his theory of gravity waves. However, it doesn't detract from the contributions he made to the community of physics and science. So just know that because I'm critiquing these rules, I'm not taking away from all the other things, I couldn't take away from all the other things that Cooper did for the Second Amendment community. Okay, so now that I've foreshadowed this impending critique of Cooper's rules, let's talk about them each in detail. So first one, all guns are always loaded. No, they're not. That's completely false. All guns are not always loaded. Not only is that false, but it's not a rule, it's just a statement, and a false statement. Now, I understand the intent behind the statement, all guns are always loaded, is to instill a hypervigilant state in the person who hears it so that they will treat all guns as if they were loaded. I get that. However, even treating all guns as if they were loaded is not really possible if you want to do things like dry fire, or if you want to do weapons maintenance, where you have to sometimes pull the trigger to disassemble the firearm. So saying that all guns are always loaded is not true, and even if you say, well, treat all guns as if they were loaded, well, now you've created this unreasonable expectation of people. Not only that, but when you go to a course, sometimes you'll have the instructor say, we'll recite these rules, they'll say all guns are always loaded, and then they'll immediately say, okay, well now they'll take their gun, and this is a gun I have with a something called a barrel block in it, so this gun cannot be loaded right now. But they'll take the gun and then they'll clear it out, and then they'll show the class the empty chamber, and they'll say, okay, now I have an unloaded gun. It's like, okay, well, are all guns always loaded, or are they only loaded sometimes? So what happens is you create this cognitive dissonance, and you allow people to determine when the rule applies and when it doesn't apply. Rather than have a rule that's robust enough to apply in multiple contexts, now you have an extreme rule or statement that can only be applied in certain contexts. Yeah, it's possible to only treat guns as if they were loaded. However, once again, then you couldn't do dry fire with actual guns. You could only use them in circumstances. I mean, I can treat a gun as if it were loaded all the time, but it's going to change what I'm able to do with that gun. I'm not going to store a gun that's completely loaded. I don't store a gun with a round in the chamber for a number of reasons. I can go over those later. But just know that this, one, it's not a rule because it's just a statement. It doesn't have any directive element to it. And then it's an unrealistic expectation of care. Moreover, there is a video of Cooper, and Cooper in the video actually says, treat all guns as if they were loaded until you confirm otherwise. So even then, he is adding such a significant addendum onto that rule that it completely changes how the rule would be applied. Now, he doesn't mean treat all guns as if they were loaded until you confirm otherwise, and then you can handle it however you want. He still understands and shares with the class in this video that even after you've confirmed it's unloaded, you still need to handle it with respect. However, he dry fires in this class and during this presentation, and he shows that, yeah, whenever you confirm it's unloaded, then you can do things like dry fire. You can't do that with a loaded gun. So you have to have that nuance of once you confirm otherwise, well, then you can treat them as though they're an unloaded gun. Now, the smart aleck in me, whenever I'm in a course and someone says all guns are always loaded, I always want to ask, and I haven't done it yet, mainly because I don't want to get kicked out of the course. I want to ask, if all guns are always loaded, then why do we need to practice reloads? And if all guns are always loaded, then why do you need to unload, show clear on the firing line? Or why do you as an instructor need to show that the gun is unloaded before you do a demonstration? The fact is, all guns are not always loaded. And when we say these things, we're creating a ridiculous standard of care for a firearm that doesn't actually apply in reality. So it can't be a rule. Rule number 2 is never let the muzzle cover anything that you're not willing to destroy. Now, this is a rule. It's a directive. It has a directive element within that rule. However, I still don't think it's robust enough to cover the wide swath of activities that you will engage in as a firearms owner. And what I mean by that is I don't want to destroy my home's hardwood floor. I don't want to destroy my ceiling. I don't want to destroy my gun safe. I don't want to destroy the floorboard of my vehicle, and a number of other things that I am constantly pointing or orienting my gun at, and I don't want to destroy them. So once again, you've created an unrealistic standard of care, because now if you abide by that rule religiously and literally, you really can't handle a gun, because unless it's always pointed at a target or always pointed at some deadly force threat that's coming at you. Now, some of you may think I'm being a smart aleck by criticizing and analyzing this rule in that way, but once again, I believe that it's important that a safety rule be such that it can be applied in every context without little details that are subjective to who is applying the rule at the time. Because whenever we add more subjectivity into how the rules are applied, then we invite more possibility for accidents to occur. So again, the rule needs to stand on itself as much as it can with little room for flexibility as possible. Rule number 3 states that you need to keep your finger off the trigger until your sights are on target. Now, this is a good rule because most unintentional discharges occur due to lack of trigger discipline. This is my safety, sir. But overall, just know that most unintentional discharges occur because of this or because something else touched the trigger. So this is a good rule. However, I think that it can be improved on a couple fronts. One, it doesn't really say how your finger needs to be off the trigger. And 2, there are many times where your finger does not need to be on the trigger and your sights are on target. If you have a weapon light and you're using that weapon light to illuminate the threat or a potential threat, you may not need to have your finger on the trigger. You may just need to have your light on and your finger off the trigger, just so that you can see what it is and if it is a threat. Don't tear me up in the comments. I'm not saying that you use a gun and just blindly sweep it around with a light to search areas. It is good to have a secondary light on you. But there's a reason we use weapon lights. And part of that is target identification, especially when it comes to a rifle. And when you have a light on your rifle and you're using it in identifying threats or possible threats with your light, it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to have your finger on the trigger. As a matter of fact, that's actually not safe to do. Having your sights on target does not necessarily mean that your finger needs to be on the trigger. And if you apply this safety rule in that context, you're actually doing the opposite of what a safety rule is intended to do. You're actually making an unsafe situation. This is why I believe that the safety rule is incomplete, and I think we can do better. Next, rule number 4 instructs us to identify our target and what is beyond it. And that's good. You should know what your target is, and then you should also know what's beyond it. But I think you should also know what's in front of it, to the peripheral, and like what's beside it. So I think we can improve on this rule as well. So now that I've ticked off probably more than half my viewers and lost some of you along the way, let's go ahead and explore some other safety rules that are out there and critique these as well. First, I want to talk about the Marine Corps safety rules. The Marine Corps safety rules were based largely on Cooper safety rules. They are: treat every weapon as if it were loaded, never point your weapon at anything you do not intend to shoot, keep your fingers straightened off the trigger until you're ready to fire, and then keep the weapon on safe until you intend to fire. If you can't tell by the way I was able to rattle those off, those are drilled into every Marine recruit from training day 1. But just know those are the 4 rules used by the Marine Corps to instill firearms safe firearms handling. So let's look at rule number 1. Treat every weapon as if it were loaded. Now, I've already critiqued this based on my understanding of what Cooper's first rule was intended for, but just know that it's impossible to treat every weapon as if it were loaded if you want to conduct things like dry fire. Yes, it's a good rule. However, I don't believe it's robust enough to be applied in every situation where you might be using a gun in training or in actual like operational activities. Rule number 2 instructs us to never point your weapon at anything you do not intend to shoot. Now, I refer to my other critique of Cooper's rule of never point your weapon at anything you do not intend to destroy, because they're basically the same thing. It's just different language: shoot versus destroy. And towards the end of this video, I'm going to go over why I don't really like the word point and I prefer a different word instead. Rule number 3 is keep your fingers straight and off the trigger until you're ready to fire. This already, I believe, is an upgrade from Cooper's rule, because rather than just saying until your sights are on target, now it adds in the shooter's state of readiness. So until you're ready to fire. You may have your sights on target, but don't put your finger on the trigger until you're ready to fire. However, I think we can do better in terms of where your finger needs to be, not just straighten off the trigger. And we'll cover that in a little bit. Rule number 4 instructs us to always keep the weapon on safe until you intend to fire. And this is great. If you have a weapon or have a firearm that has a safety on it, that safety should always be on until you are intending to fire. Now, all guns don't have safeties, don't have external manual safeties. So I don't like to include this in the main set of rules. I like to put this in what I like to call safety guidelines. But having this as a rule, once again, it's not robust enough to apply to all weapons. Next, we'll look at the NRA safety rules. And the first one is always keep the gun pointed in a safe direction. Always keep your finger off the trigger until ready to shoot. And then always keep the gun unloaded until ready to use. Now that first rule is good, but again, I have a problem with the word pointed. The second one's great, but I still think we need to clarify how the finger needs to be off the trigger, not just straighten off the trigger, not just off the trigger. And then the third one is probably one of my favorite safety rules, because while other rules assume that the person handling the gun understands the rules, this rule places the gun in a state such that if the person doesn't know safety rules, the likelihood for an unintentional discharge is much less likely. Even if someone who doesn't know how to apply gun safety gets access to it, it still is such a high threshold before they would actually have an accidental discharge. Many other variations of these safety rules and new unique safety rules exist, but just to keep this video relatively short, I'm not going to go into those. If you want to look into them, I can list them below. But just know that these are kind of what I consider the most influential ones out right now. Next, I want to go back to the original modes we listed earlier, the modes that cause an unintentional discharge or lead to an unintentional discharge. So we can use that to evaluate the safety rules that we've already covered and possibly look at some other safety rules that might be more robust in the broad sense of firearms ownership. Those modes were: you need a gun that is loaded with a round in the chamber. You need something or someone to unintentionally actuate the trigger until the firing process starts. And then, if the gun is oriented at a person, the potential for an accidental gun injury or death is present. I'd argue that that last mode is probably the one that we need to focus on the most. So let's start off with how to mitigate that one. Always keep the gun oriented in the safest direction. I'll say it again, always keep the gun oriented in the safest direction. Right off the bat, you could probably tell that rather than use the word point, I've used the word orient. The reason for this is I believe that when we say point, most people think of pointing as an intentional task. They don't think of pointing as something you do unintentionally, because it's not. Think about your fingers, for example. If I have my fingers like this on my lap, I don't know if you can see them right now. Let's say I have them right here. If I have my fingers right here, I'm not intentionally pointing my fingers, but they are oriented, in fact, upward. I think it's important to think about where something is oriented, especially as it relates to a firearm, because it doesn't matter whether or not you were intentionally pointing it at something. What matters is where the gun is oriented when it goes off. Secondly, I say safest direction because at any given moment, the possible directions that you could orient your gun in fall along a safety continuum. It's kind of a gradient of there are certain directions that are more safe than others, but they're still safe. And then there are certain directions that are more dangerous than others. So that's why I say safest direction, because I want the person to constantly be thinking about what is the safest direction, not just what is a safe direction. Maybe I am splitting hairs on this, and maybe this makes no difference whatsoever, but I've thought about it a lot, and I think that using the terminology safest direction actually matters. Because there are certain instances where a safe direction actually doesn't even exist. Now, if you don't believe me, think about a multi-story apartment or a multi-story hotel. If you're in one of those intermediate levels of that hotel, like second floor, and you have someone below you and someone above you, and then you have someone on each side of you in front and back, where do you orient your gun? It's always going to be possible that you're orienting your gun, if it's at a wall or the ceiling or the floor, it's always possible that you're going to be orienting your gun in a direction that's not 100% safe. However, there may be directions that are more safe than others, so you need to think about that whenever you're orienting your gun in space. Or on Earth, if you're not an astronaut and you're not oriented. Next, let's address, once again, the most common reason for unintentional discharges, and that is this: a lack of trigger discipline. Now, as you know, or as I hope you know, guns are designed to go off, or guns are designed to fire when the trigger is pulled and the gun's loaded. And generally speaking, guns are very good at this. So if a gun is loaded and you pull the trigger, it's probably going to go off. Whether you meant it to or not, it's going to go off. And so I think it's important that we address this one next, because this is probably the biggest reason we have unintentional discharges. And Hollywood doesn't do us any favors in this regard, because it seems like most movies out there involving guns have actors or actresses with their fingers on the trigger before they're ready to shoot. And so I have a theory that we've basically been indoctrinating people with entertainment on how to handle guns, instead of having people go to a course or learn it in the military or in law enforcement training. We've been training people by movies and entertainment on how to handle guns, and that's why we have such a problem. People see that trigger and they think, oh, it's a place to rest my finger. So I think it's important that we address that next, because it's, once again, one of the biggest reasons we have those unintentional discharges. The rule I believe mitigates this is always keep your finger high off the trigger until ready to shoot. And I use the word high off the trigger because of this. If you're holding the gun, you have a couple options here with keeping your finger off the trigger. You can do straight and off the trigger, and that's what they trained us in the Marine Corps. They said keep your finger straight and off the trigger. And part of the reason I think they did this was because we were dumb recruits, and so if your finger's straight, then it's off the trigger. However, the problem with this is if your finger is just straight and off the trigger, there is not much that's protecting your finger from slipping into the trigger guard and actually actuating that trigger. So having your finger high and off the trigger means that you can have it up here on the frame, and now is much less likely for your finger to slip inside that trigger guard. Now, what are some things that would cause that? Well, for one, if you have a reflex response, which a reflex response is just literally when you tense up, like if someone startles you, or you see those brake lights rush into you, the car in front of you in afternoon traffic, you tense up. And a lot of times what happens when we tense up is our fingers curl, and this is to protect our body. It's part of the fight or flight mechanisms inside of our body. And if your finger is just resting on the front of that trigger guard and you tense up, there's a good chance it can slip off and then actuate that trigger. However, when your finger is up here, high on the frame, if you tense up all you want, and it's just going to be pushing pressure into the frame and into the slide. So keep your finger high and off the trigger. Not only does it help mitigate having an accidental or negligent discharge from a reflex response, but it also enables those next to you to see that your finger is in fact off the trigger. So if you go to a course or you're doing any type of training or a competition and your finger is supposed to be off the trigger, having your finger up here is much better for people identifying that your finger's off the trigger than having your finger down here. But when it's up here, you can see straight through the trigger guard and confirm that the finger is in fact off the trigger. The final rule I want to go over is probably going to be the most controversial because it is in conflict with one of Cooper's rules, and that is always keep your gun unloaded until ready to use. Now, the reason this is in conflict, obviously, is because his rule is all guns are always loaded. This rule is always keep your gun unloaded until ready to use. I believe that this rule is based in reality, whereas his rule is just a fictional statement. It's important to keep your gun unloaded until ready to use, once again, because all the other rules assume that the person handling the gun or in possession of the gun understand the firearms rules and understand how to apply them. However, this one puts the gun in a state where even if the person doesn't know how to apply safe gun handling, the gun is still in a relatively safe condition. So if I take this gun, let's say I don't have the barrel block in here, and it's unloaded right now, and I set it down, and I tell my, which I would never do this, but I tell my kids to play with it. There is no way the gun could go off because it can't be loaded. They would have to grab a magazine, insert that magazine properly, grab a full magazine, insert that magazine properly, and then they would have to cycle the slide, which I know adults that can't cycle the slide, and then they would have to pull the trigger or press the trigger. Even if I take a magazine, this one's not a loaded magazine, but even if I take a magazine and insert a magazine that's loaded, well, there's still no round in the chamber. So once again, someone has to rack it in order to rack that round into the chamber. So once again, if I have imagine it's a full magazine. If I have a full magazine inserted and no round in the chamber, the gun is still in a much safer condition than having a round in the chamber, especially for storage. Now, once again, I would never do that. I would never just take my gun, insert a loaded magazine, and then set it on the countertop and just, go about my day. I wouldn't do that because I like to add as many safety layers as I can within reason, such that they don't significantly impede my ability to defend myself or others. However, having no round in the chamber creates such a high barrier to having a negligent discharge that I believe it's important to have that as a rule. To sum up the 3 most important safety rules, or the 3 most important that I believe, they are always keep your gun oriented in the safest direction, always keep your finger high off the trigger until ready to shoot, and then always keep the gun unloaded until ready to use. So yeah, those are the safety rules that I believe are most important. You may disagree with me, and if you do, that's great. That's what makes this country great. So comment below if you think I'm wrong, if you think there was something I missed, or you think something I should add, and I will look at it and see whether or not it's something that I believe is valid and should be included. That's all for now, and thanks again for watching, and until next time, train to a higher standard.